Welcome to InfoSpeaks, a webinar series brought to you by UMSI Development and Alumni Relations, focused on important and forward-looking topics in the information field. I'm Colleen van Lent, a teaching professor at the University of Michigan School of Information and your moderator for the next hour. I'm a woman with shoulder-length brown hair and a warm striped sweater for this ridiculous April weather. Inspiration for this event arose from a desire to combine the UMSI theme topic, the future of work, and important perspectives raised in this year's UMSI Community Read book selection, Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century, edited by Alice Wong. I am joined by three panelists today, whose expertise includes accessibility and computing, digital disability cultures, contemporary political theory, artificial intelligence, and generative AI. Please feel free to submit questions at any time in the chat for our Q&A section later on. We welcome all questions, whether they stem from curiosity, uncertainty, or lived experience. I will now let each panelist introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Ann.
Hi, I'm Annie Hefferman. I'm an assistant professor in political science, and my work focuses mostly on disability and questions of citizenship and how we think about and define citizenship.
David?
Hello, everyone out there in internet land. I am David Adelman. I'm a lecturer in DSI, which is the Digital Studies Institute. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, I am a recently hired lecturer, and I was recently rehired, so it's very exciting. And my areas of expertise include sexual disability cultures, disability culture online, and disability media, and accessible cultures in general. So it's very exciting to be with all of you this afternoon.
Thank you, David. Robin?
Hi, everyone. I am Robin Brewer. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a Black woman with coily, medium length hair, wearing some glasses and a top with some scalloped sleeves. I am an assistant professor in the School of Information here at Michigan, and my research is in the human-computer interaction space, focused on accessibility and aging. So I ask how we can design better technologies and online platforms for disabled people and for people over the age of 65 who may be likely to acquire an age-related disability.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for the introductions, and let's jump right into it. I'd like to start today with some of the questions that we came up with as a group when we were thinking about this topic space. The first one is, what are the realities for disabled folks in the workplace currently? Anne, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, so I think one thing to start off with is what we know is that employment rates for disabled people are less than half of what they are for non-disabled people. So that's one of the realities that we're looking at, that access to employment is difficult for a variety of reasons. So I think a lot of what we're looking at in the workplace today, or what I look at, is both efforts by companies to explicitly hire disabled people, so targeted hiring practices. There are a number of critiques around that, but looking at how companies like JP Morgan have started programs hiring particularly neurodivergent employees. So looking at how companies can both improve employment, whether it's through virtual work or other technologies. So.
David, do you have anything to add to that?
So yes, I can perhaps add a little bit more specificity, because that was an excellent sort of introduction to this topic. So for me, as a scholar and researcher, I'm particularly invested in two complementary strands. One is the notion of various disability cultures and what disability culture looks like online, and also what we might consider to be techno-bureaucracies of care, or the intersection between culture and technology and the infrastructures that give rise to how we treat disability, both from a historic and technological point of view. And to build off of Anne's excellent point, a lot of the sort of administration around work is this question of how to render disabled people traditionally productive, right? And when I say traditionally productive, I mean in a sort of capitalist political sense of rendering the disabled body fit. And there have been many schemes of doing this, but the current problem, as Anne also pointed out, with disability and work is that our schemes of infrastructure and care are also linked to asset limits. So, for instance, in the United States, at least, Medicaid is the only program that will provide long-term continuous in-home care, which many people with physical disabilities, and I am one of these, rely on to have the ability to get up and move around the day. And so what that means is that even if someone has the hypothetical ability to work, we are often uh, fitted into poverty by design. And of course, I'm not a pessimist. There are multiple legislative things in the work to raise asset limits. For instance, just last week, the Democratic side of Congress is trying to raise the asset limits from $2,000 to $10,000, and we hope that that actually happens. It's highly unlikely to happen given our current political landscape. But the point is that there are things at work. But to briefly address the question again, you asked, what does the current landscape of work look like for people with disabilities? And it is inexorably intertwined with economic policy as well.
Thank you, David. Robin, I know you wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, and it actually relates to what part of what David was saying around care and the realities there. So I think there are two aspects to this conversation about disability and labor and workforce. The first part is disabled people who are in the workforce or that are making strides to get into the workforce. And then there's this other side, which is a little bit more meta perhaps, but related, which is how the workforce is currently being designed to support disabled people. And my work focuses on that latter part, the workforce design in the context of care and caregiving with older adults. And what we're seeing in the reality of our current care environment is that there are lots of discussions about care being a crisis. And we're seeing this both in the disability context and in the aging combined with disability context, because societies are experiencing having more people over the age of 60 than under the age of 18 for the first time in history. So I think that's a reality around what is this framing? Does it have to be a crisis framing, and how we are approaching it?
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pivot just slightly to the idea of some of the things you've mentioned first are the challenges. And I know we're going to talk about some of the areas of joy in the next couple of questions, but as you've brought up some of the challenges that people are facing, can you share some examples, again, both positive and negative, anything, and talk about what's working and what might not be working as well right now in this space? David, I know you just gave a beautiful answer on the last one. Can I hop on you for the first one? Response for here too.
So, speaking as someone who is physically disabled, I live with cerebral palsy. I'm a full-time wheelchair user. And so my research is very close to my heart. I am very much interested in thinking about how we can reimagine work and labor. so sometimes this is advocating for legislative and policy change, and sometimes that means strategically leaning into the virtual as much as possible. I know we have a question that has come up later about the use of virtual as an accommodation, and I can speak to that perhaps a little bit later. But the reality is that basically what's in useful and interesting as a disabled academic and also someone who's always interested in work is using resources strategically and framing yourself in the ways that will make you appear to be the right applicant, but also advocating for your needs and not being afraid to advocate for those needs, which can be difficult in certain circumstances. But you were asking what sort of brings me joy, and as someone who was born with a disability and lives with it every day, the only way that advocacy work can work for me is if I find some joy in it. So I hope that that answers your question.
Definitely answered mine. But I'd love to also hear from Robin and Ann. Robin, did you want to add to that?
Sure, yeah, I do want to add to that in terms of what's not working in our current reality and some opportunities and ways that we're seeing that researchers, technologists are trying to respond to this in ways that do work. I think that there are two major issues. One is around how caregiving is being thought about, particularly in that a lot of research centers the needs of the caregiver or the professional medical staff rather than the disabled person who is receiving that care. On the bright side, though, I think we're starting to see more of these human-centered approaches that really consider the needs of the disabled person at the same time as the caregiver, rather than excluding that voice. There are also lots of conversations about the big two letters, AI, artificial intelligence, being used to support some of the more challenging aspects of care work, maybe some of the more burdening parts and components. The challenge is doing this in a way that AI does not replace human care, labor, and work. And I think we're seeing more research. My research group is also looking into this of how can AI support rather than replace human care. And we're looking at communication, for example. Effective communication is a known barrier within the care domain. And so how might AI be able to make it easier or better structure difficult care related conversations, and really arguing that AI doesn't always have to be used for example, disability detection, in part because there are lots of errors that can happen with that. And because this limits the scope of AI use, but how can we think about AI more broadly to support care labor?
Thanks, Robin. And do you see any challenge, do you see how people are navigating these challenges today that we brought up earlier?
Yeah, so just to pick up on something David was saying, both in his last response and the previous one thing that comes up a lot in my research and in just interacting with friends is sort of the work disincentives aspect of things. So the asset limits, like one of the notorious cases that I know of, not notorious, but sort of fascinating, was someone who was hired as a lecturer at Berkeley, but if they paid her the way they usually paid lecturers, she would lose access to transportation to get to the job that she was working at. So there are all these ways that I think, and the value of that care or that transportation far exceeds what you're going to earn in a job. So it isn't a matter of just find a really well-paying job and you can replace the cost of that care or the amount of supplemental security income or disability income that you're going to receive. But I think more personally, so I also have cerebral palsy. It is interesting moving into spaces where disability is not expected. So I think as an academic, at Michigan, there are a lot of programs oriented towards facilitating access for students. And it's only recently that we've gotten programs for staff and faculty, because that just wasn't factored in as an issue. That academics or staff were confronting. So I think entering into spaces where it's not expected, even though it may be prevalent or present, is always sort of a dance that you have to make of how do I ask for accommodations in a way that doesn't make me seem like a non-productive faculty member. Even if it's small accommodations, just those kinds of dances. Even though in my own work, I'm very critical of the idea that like productivity is the key to citizenship, but at the same time, like balancing those aspects.
Thank you, Anne. That really ties back directly to what I wanted to talk about next, which is centering us back on the idea of the future of work, right? That's what this symposium is about. I feel that we have a lot of alumni in the audience right now. I want to say hi to everybody right there. I know that we have students watching, so future workplace people as well. I would like to just ask each of you, before we jump into some of the live questions, what's the future of recognizing the value and needs of people, of disabled folks in the workplace, right? So we've talked a lot about, accommodations and asking for accommodations and things like that. But what do you see things looking like going forward? Whether it's the AI that Robin mentioned, legislation, David, as you mentioned, I'd love to know what you kind of see in the future moving forward, if you predict any trends. I think, Robin, I haven't had you go first yet, if you want to jump in.
Sure, I'll jump in. Originally, when I thought about this question, I was thinking, I'll talk more about the AI landscape, but I think it would be remiss of me not to mention our current political environment, which is trying to remove accessibility from everything. So I think that recognition legally, federally may be difficult, but I think there are more small scale efforts, organizations, even companies who are trying to keep this work alive, literally accessibility work in the workplace. So I recently had two people from Adobe guest lecture in an intro to accessibility course that I teach. And what I found interesting is that one who is a design manager with ADHD framed their disability and disability more broadly as a design use case. And he was talking about how he always incorporates disability into some use case with engineers and product managers, people who might not be exposed to disability. So for example, he always shows new or proposed iterations to designs at Adobe in grayscale to demonstrate the effects of, say, poor color contrast, which would affect those who are colorblind, for example, because this not only is about disability, but shows the spectrum of how design can affect a broader audience. So I think we are going to start to see our future of work and disability is going to be a lot more people trying to do this accessibility work that has been federally constrained in ways that are meaningful to whether it's their company or their organization or their communities.
Thank you, Robin. Anne, how about you?
Yeah, I think a very similar response, just that in the current moment, we're kind of watching these protections recede. And I think a lot of um, the maybe progress that we made during COVID in terms of remote work and access to remote work that facilitated a lot of people being able to access jobs that they might not have otherwise been able to, are also starting to recede. So I think trying to navigate that space of not having that framework of protections or having uncertain protections, and what does that look like going forward? Um, and to be honest, I'm not sure. But I think you are seeing specific companies sort of com remaining committed to those projects in very interesting ways. Um, so yeah.
David, did I ping you yet? I'm
Not
getting
yet.
so into the answers here that I'm sometimes losing
No,
track.
that's okay. So I could answer this in many different ways, and I'm just going to sort of pick up on the AI side of things because that's also deeply interesting to me as someone who writes and produces digital media culture. There's a lot of anxiety about what cultural production will look like with AI. And so I don't want to take us too far off into the weeds, but I'm of two minds here. On the one hand, I am deeply suspicious of the kinds of ways that intelligence has been talked about in the context of artificial intelligence and automation. I'm going to say something that may be slightly spicy here, at least for a computer or information school science, but like AI intelligence is not actually intelligence. It's really good at pattern recognition and it is good at generating new patterns. But the question of whether or not that is um, intelligence, I'm deeply suspicious of for various reasons, in part because there has been a lot invested from a disability studies perspective in declaring intelligence to be one singular thing. And in fact, more and more research suggests that we have many ways of sensing and apprehending the world, right? So, on the one hand, very suspicious of the sort of extractive elements of AI, but on the other hand, I'm a pragmatist, right? And I recognize that AI is not going anywhere and that it is increasingly going to become part of our media literacy landscape. It reminds me very much, very deeply, speaking to the Adobe side of things, right? Where in the 90s, there was this great and deep anxiety over digital image generation and the question of whether or not we could determine whether something was real. And this is, of course, part of a long history of the question of what is real in culture. But now we have Photoshop as a verb, right? And people, generally speaking, have knowledge of the fact that everything has a filter, everything has the capacity to be shaped and molded and things of this nature. So to answer the question of what does the future of work look like, what I am hopeful for, my optimistic side of things, is that AI, as we currently use it, can be used to reduce repetitious tasks, which have historically been very difficult for people with disabilities. In other words, to take as much of the non-productive labor, which is, of course, all of that phrase is deeply loaded, but to take the repetitious task and to leave other aspects of creativity to the to our own individual voices and activism and advocacy and capacity to create. So I hope that that is useful to this audience, and I can absolutely speak more to that if people are curious. But yes, that's my attempt to be um, specific and not take myself into the weeds.
Right. David, we're getting some definite thumbs up on your comments, particularly on the idea that AI is not intelligent or intelligence. I think we're correct in that this idea of AI future of work, it's always going to be tied together. It came up it was a major focus of the previous UMSI speaks on the future of automotive and mobility UX design. But I was really happy to see, for anyone who wants to watch that one, the idea of accessibility still pops up, right? Like this idea of the human-centered approach and what is it that we're making easier for people, right? I want my AI to, I'm going to steal this from my friend I had coffee with. I want AI to do my laundry, not to write the books I'm reading, right? I don't want it to replace the things that I enjoy in life. I want it to do some of the tasks that I really find unpleasant. So thank you all. We're going to go to some of the questions that we're getting in. Again, I want to encourage anyone who's watching online to submit their questions. I'm going to give a little shout out to the SEMA group, who I know is doing a watch party right now. So if you wanted to send us some questions, we'd appreciate it. And I also want to frame it in that I know that talking about disability can be a scary place for people sometimes, right? They don't want to say the wrong things. So I encourage you to get on and ask those questions and from our speakers. I'm just thrilled with how much they know about it. I'm going to go to one of the questions from our former faculty and staff, and it's, can you speak to the invisible and often stigmatized or misunderstood disabilities, such as autism, chronic illness, ADHD, which often include sensory sensitivities or stamina issues that affect workplace integration? What opportunities exist to help employers and work colleagues understand, accommodate, and more importantly, welcome these people into the workplace? And you seem to perk up there. I was going to turn to you if you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is one space where remote work has been really helpful. But also we are seeing companies be a lot more, and certain companies, not all, obviously, be a lot more mindful, particularly around sensory issues, and being a lot more aware of the needs of staff that exceed, I think, what we might think of as like traditional accessibility issues. But at the same time, I think I also want to acknowledge the difficulty here in disclosure. So I think a lot of people, myself included, like I have a visible disability. It's very evident to people when I walk, but I think it is much more difficult to sort of admit to an employer something like that sounds like it might have a productivity effect. And we are seeing employers be a lot more mindful of that and willing to accommodate it, but it still is that kind of dance around, what do I ask for? How much do I disclose? Who do I disclose it to? And how does that affect the workplace? But at the same time, we are seeing companies sort of redesign how they design workspaces. So to facilitate people who are neurodivergent, looking at lighting design. So you are seeing people be a lot more creative around these areas. But I think it is that dance of disclosure of what do you want to disclose to an employer. Yeah.
I don't know if Rob or David, you have anything to add. I can personally add that I know that for myself, I have to have an accommodation or a request for people to not have their ceiling fans on during Zoom meetings. It's these little things that often people are happy to, for my, disability, are happy to accommodate. But that isn't always the case when you have something that as the question poser said, is kind of that stigmatized disability.
Yeah.
So I can very briefly and incompletely answer a question from one perspective, which is, again, I write and I teach about disability culture all the time, right? And one of the moves of disability culture, as opposed to disability as a medical diagnosis, is the notion that our disabilities may have a physical or psychological or emotional component, but that largely, like, our experiences of our disability will shift based on context, right? And so this is how I think often about visible and invisible diagnosis, like autism and uh, uh, ADHD. And so, from a teaching perspective, right, I think about the various aspects of access that I can institute in the classroom without asking. And this takes the burden of disclosure off of my students as much as possible. And I don't know that not all of us are in academia and not all of us are desiring of teaching, right? But there are various practices that we can institute in our daily lives to take the burden of disclosure off of people. And this is not to say that any single access practice is going to be perfect for everyone, but it's about being willing to have those conversations with people. And sometimes, as has astutely pointed out, those conversations can feel difficult. But the key is to find those communities, whether they are at work or as part of your support network, that will allow you to continually have these conversations and so that you can practice. Because as with queer theory and other kinds of things, disclosure is not a single event. It is something that we continually have to do. And so if you practice it, it becomes easier.
Yeah, and can I add to that?
Of course, Ron.
I plus one everything that has been said. I think invisible disabilities are less understood than more visible or apparent disabilities. And I see this even in just the classroom environment, teaching about accessibility, asking students at the beginning of class to give examples of disability, and it's very rare that someone will mention an invisible disability. And so I think in the workplace, how this translates is that there may be more of a legitimization issue where people might not recognize something as a disability or acknowledge that something is an invisible disability. And even being on teams in industry and academia with disabled people, I've noticed that there are opportunities that exist around awareness and what David was saying in terms of building more systemic accessibility changes. Like, for example, turning on live captions automatically at in-person and Zoom meetings, or people who might have regular training on their teams about appropriate heading structure in documents, or who might share documentation about how to add alternative text to images, etc. So I think having more of these kind of advocating for more cultural shifts on teams to support invisible and more visible disabilities are important for creating a culture, not just an accessibility culture, but just a better workplace culture. And that kind of spreads, doing so kind of spreads this work, right? Because this does take work to do, may be able to spread this work around more equitably. So it's not always the disabled person who is making these asks or calling for these training sessions, etc. So something around awareness and more systemic changes that are not just the responsibility of the disabled person.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We have questions coming in, and two are similar, so I'd like to put them together for you. One is from the Sasima Watch Party and also Aisha. The question is, how do we dismantle the barriers to accessibility? And the follow-up question is, what's one barrier to inclusion you've personally seen or experienced in school or workplace, and one step that could be taken to remove it? So if I kind of wanted to combine those together for you is there a barrier that you have seen or that maybe you haven't seen but is really important to you? And can you think of a step, like an actionable step that could be taken to remove it? Anne, how about you?
I mean, mine, I think just to use a personal example, and this is something relatively minor, but I think it illustrates a lot of, it illustrates well how small things can have huge consequences. So, I taught a lecture for the first time 2 years ago. Most lecture halls don't have seats for the lecturer. They have seats for the students. Um, and I can stand, but I can't stand and talk intelligently at the same time. That's too much brain power. And so I had requested a stool, but it took 6 months to arrive. And so that sort of dance, if this is something so insignificant, but it became this kind of, oh, well, we need to get the right kind of stool. And I was like, no, 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 just give me a stool, like any stool. But I think things like that that sort of reflect both who we imagine in that space. So why aren't there, seats for the lecturer, or why do we structure talks in the way that we do? Um, but also kind of what mechanisms do we have to sort of solve those problems, and how do we get creative about those? And I think what David was saying around sort of having practices, obviously you can't anticipate every need that people have, but I think lowering the barriers to that and somehow making that easier. But I'm not, yeah, I think in my own experience, it really has relied on sort of people in positions of authority being much more aware of these issues than I've experienced in the past. But I think it is amazing being in a space that is kind of accessible in multiple ways. So I always use the example of there's a BART station in BART is the Bay Area Rapid Transit in Berkeley. That is where, and on top of that is a center where a lot of disability organizations are housed, and it was designed to be sort of universally accessible, and it's amazing being in that space. There aren't stairs, like everything is kind of designed to be accessible, but they've taken everything into account, from like textures in the flooring that help people with low vision. So I think being creative about what accessibility looks like and really factoring that into the choices that you're making. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I love design. So this is like my geek out moment.
David and Robin, do either of you have a personal anecdote or something you would like to bring up where you can talk about a barrier to inclusion that you've seen or that you've seen become dismantled?
So I will try once again to be brief. My apologies if it is not brief. But so I used to say I was your classic academic and saying, "Oh, I want to do research. I don't want to teach. I appreciate the labor of teaching, but teaching isn't for me. It doesn't feel real." And then I came to the University of Michigan, where I have been really deeply supported by the DSI, and I got my first sort of extended experience in the classroom, and I've taught here in person and hybrid and now completely virtual, right? So I experienced all different modes, and part of my anxiety, right, of teaching, I've come to realize, is because I was trying to make myself fit into an inaccessible classroom, like Anne was just pointing out. Because when I was coming up and doing my PhD, you read all of these pedagogical aids that are supposed to design you, or it's supposed to help you teach, and they are like, don't stand in front of the classroom, think pair share, move around the classroom, get to know people, bend down to the, and I'm like, well, excuse my language, but fuck me as a disabled person, right? It's because I can't physically move through a classroom that has either electroseating or has rows of things and things of this nature. And so what was a moment of dismantling that is when I just decided that as part of my teaching practice, I was going to be upfront with my students and I was going to say, there are things that I cannot do. There are things that I may need help with. There are ways of interacting with people, but also leaving space for other students to come forward and to share their needs as well. Because in my experience, the moment at which you as an instructor or as a safe space person, whether you're in the workplace or not, or I mean, in teaching in a university or not, the moment that you signal that you are a safe space, it creates a more accessible culture of access in general, right? And so once I stopped trying to be a different kind of teacher and embraced what I do well, my classes became much more enlivened. We have had a range of wonderful experiences, right? But it was all when I stopped trying to fit into a particular mode, right? And so this is what accessibility looks like for me. And like, I recognize that it can be difficult to be vulnerable. Sometimes it's dangerous, but ideally, right, it's part of a practice, it's part of a community of care, right? And I spend a lot of time talking to other people about that because in our society, we are taught from a very early age that we have to be as independent as possible, right? And that is deeply toxic, right? And that's part of our work culture, right? Anyway, that's my response, and I thank you for giving me the time to respond in that way.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to build off of that, particularly around David's example regarding in-person accessibility. And so my first thought when you asked this question, Colleen, was around this push towards more in-person only events. Now we were reflecting about working from home and remote work earlier in the conversation. And so it made me think about the inaccessibility of in-person events. And so, you know, they might have their benefits, but particularly those that are offered only in person do not allow participation by, for example, people who cannot enter inaccessible physical environments. I had an experience, I think this was last semester, where, or maybe 2 semesters ago, where I was teaching in an ADA compliant room, but their compliance around wheelchair accessibility was that someone would have to take a wheelchair, go all the way in the basement, take a wheelchair to the front of the room, or take an elevator to the front of the room. But the elevator was broken and it had been broken for months. And so there are some things around physical accessibility with in-person only events. The other is that it's an inaccessible experience for people with chronic health conditions that might experience flare-ups where they might not be able to attend in person. So that's kind of what grinds my gears. Oh, the other frustration I have is that, and this is something that people may think is minor, but you know, there are attempts to make these in-person spaces more accessible. For example, offering a hybrid component, but it's similar to ADA compliance versus actually being accessible because you can't hear anyone in the room when the microphone is only for the speaker and not for those asking questions or leaving comments. So what I'm really trying to say is that people are considering accessibility, but I don't know if that dismantling has happened yet, that dismantling part of the question, because we're not thinking about the holistic, the overall accessible experience. We might just be thinking about one component as opposed to the other components of the environment or the other members in the audience.
So I'm just going to jump on the soapbox for a quick second because, you know, like you as an educator, I'm deeply disappointed at the idea that our students may not go out into the world and immediately see the barriers, right? I think we as an institution have a responsibility to be educating and exposing students to every possible scenario, so they are the ones going out into the workforce and saying, what? Like, how is this even possible? I know Michigan students are accused of being arrogant. If they are accused of being arrogant about knowing too much about accessibility, I'll take it, right? Like, they should be going out and demanding things in the world that they might not have known about, right? Like things that I'm learning every day. So I would like to say that's, as a school, I'm highly disappointed if we aren't putting this at the forefront of what our students are learning in any class, whether it's a class associated with accessibility or not. We have about 10 minutes and our questions now are starting to come. So I'm going to start putting questions out for more rapid fire answer. Only respond if you feel like if you want to. Here was one that was interesting from Austin, and it's, what metrics should organizations use to meaningfully track progress in disability inclusion? Is tracking hiring numbers or regular surveying employees really enough to quantify progress? Do any of you have any experience with that kind of quantifying progress? I'm not sure. And if not, then
This is Robin. I do not. However, what I will say is that quantifying progress is very similar. What I teach, accessibility is not just a goal, but it's a mindset. You're not going to reach 100% accessibility and then be done. I think this question about progress is that the goal should constantly be moving, right? If you made progress on something, you can make progress on something else. And although I'm not sure exactly how to quantify that, I like this idea of saying it should be a continuous process as opposed to you hit it and then you're done.
thank you, Robin. Does anyone have, this is another question we have, how do we get employers to better understand that disabled employees offer value beyond sheer productivity? I know we've touched on this earlier. These perspectives, their perspectives and experiences are invaluable. So how do we elevate that in the eyes of employers, sorry. And David, I'm going to put you on the spot for just a second, because I do remember you talking about this earlier, about how, in somewhat of this capitalist society, it's about production, right? Like input, output. Do your students ever ask you about this in your class? Or I personally think the arts is a great place to think about it.
So, this is also tied into the question of what counts as knowledge, right? And so, for me, right, for a lot of discourse around disability, right, some of us, whether we have ADHD or physical disabilities, we have a hard time sitting down for a long time and writing out essayistic papers, right? But we may be able to easily speak for 2 hours into a digital voice recorder and have really complex, really deep, really interesting thoughts. And so, to answer the question, right, it's the easy answer is that it's going to be contextual depending on the employer, but really it's about making your knowledge visible, right? Because you can make the argument repeatedly that I have this experience, but you really have to find ways of showing, right? And so sometimes that means creatively suggesting to your boss, well, I have this much experience in this kind of thing, let me show it to you, right? Which can often mean additional labor to begin with in your at your on your part. Sorry, my sentences are falling apart here. But the point is it's about finding ways to respond to your employer in ways that work for you, right? And so, yeah.
You were muted, Colleen.
Sorry, yeah, thanks everyone. My dog was barking in the background, so I muted it. Thank you, David. I know that I struggle as an instructor, like the rubrics and the metrics we put into our assignments. And just again, probably only have time for one maybe of you to answer, but if any of you have group projects, right? What do you do to adjust expectations about deadlines and timelines to accommodate, the quote is crip time, not being able to know, be able to predict one's capacity or productivity. I was wondering if any of you have any thoughts on that.
I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, I will say political science is not big on group projects, but part of my approach has been because I've when I did the teaching academy, they brought in students to talk about what they liked and they didn't like in classrooms. And one of the points about group projects was also from non-traditional students saying it's really hard for us to do group projects if we have kids and we're older and families because, you know, it's great as a college student to be like, we're going to meet at the bar at 11 p.m. to talk about our group project. That's just not possible. So I think in my class, I've tried to give people as many options as possible while still making it feasible for me to do the grading and give them feedback. So for example, in my disability class, students have the option of writing sort of a traditional 5 to 7 page paper. They also had the option of doing a podcast, which they could do with a group. And they just had to talk to me about how they were facilitating that. Or they could do a zine. So I think giving people options around what kind of work they can do and how they can do it. So you're kind of meeting people where you're at and not creating kind of more barriers than are necessary. So I tend to also not have in-class tests, that kind of thing. So making as many options as possible without making it an overwhelming amount of work for you as an instructor or as a grader.
And to add to that, because one thing that I've done around group projects reminds me of what Anne just mentioned. I've incorporated two approaches to group projects that I think can help with, for example, to support neurodivergent students or other disabled students. One is to allow people to choose if they want to work in a group or individually for that reason around varying time and collaboration preferences due to access needs, access conflicts. The other is to avoid having a singular deadline for the final project. I think that deadline can, one, induce a lot of anxiety, but then also not leave flexibility for varying time-related access needs. And so instead, I have a few mini milestones where they're getting feedback along the way in the last month and a half of the semester that then leads up to the actual final assessment, which is this written submission. Sorry, my dog is now scratching in the back. And so I think that, and she's going to keep going, I'm so sorry. But I think having these multiple deadlines is useful because you're getting feedback along the way of how to improve and not just at the end when it's too late.
David, before you even potentially start, I'm recognizing time, and there was one really good question. There's two questions left, but there's one really good question I wanted to have each of you answer, because again, we only have about 4 minutes before I know some of our panelists need to leave. And that question is, what would a radically accessible workplace look and feel like to you? I was going to kind of challenge each of you to answer that question for me, if you don't mind. Any takers to go first?
I'll go first and I'll be incredibly quick, right? So, as quick as I can possibly be, which is to say that a radically accessible workplace for me, in disability studies, we have this concept called body minds, right? And thinking about the body and the mind together as an expression of the self. And so for me, what a radically accessible workplace would be one where staggered work, very basically, right? The notion that you can produce on your own schedule that accommodates your own way of working, right? And this is what makes it radical because that breaks out of a 9 to 5 section. And I will stop there. I have thoughts on the other question, but I also want to uh, be aware of other people. So thank you very much.
And how about you?
Yeah, I think very similar to David's answer. I think lowering the barriers to sort of accessibility and the way we measure productivity, but also I think making it such that the people who are it's not on disabled employees to make these requests, or if they are, it's requests that other people are making as well, whether it's around having children and needing accommodations around that, but sort of lowering the barriers to and expanding what we think of as things we should talk about in the workplace.
Robin?
Mine is actually very similar. I would say radically accessible workplace means not needing to ask for accommodations. I know we were talking about AI earlier and, the harms and the risk, but maybe there's a way that the accommodation is somehow sensed and then just done. No one needs to ask. It is already built in.
Even though I'm a moderator, I'm going to throw in my own answer as well, because I think there is some level of fatigue to creating a fully accessible environment because everything's always changing. Scenarios come up that you never think about. In my mind, a radically accessible workplace would be one where everything is funded. Like it is not volunteer work. It's not extra work. Time is built into every employee's schedule that would say, and we're going to assume you need 10% time to deal with things, unexpected things that come up. So just wanted to throw my own personal one in there as well.
I endorse that.
It's 2:59, and while I feel like this conversation could go on forever and it would be a really good conversation, I do know some of our panelists need to go. So I wanted to say many thanks to our panelists and to the UMSI Office of Organizational Culture and Community, who inspired the topic through the community read and co-organized this event with UMSI Development and Alumni Relations. I also want to thank all of you for attending and realizing the importance of this topic, and I hope that you'll go out and become, if we're going to use the phrase leaders in the best, the true leaders in the best, by focusing on making this a more accessible world, workplace, and student area. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, the panelists.